We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Michelle Yu. She is the founder of Aspire Talent. Michelle, thanks for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our audience, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thanks, Christina. Excited to be here. I go by she, her pronouns, and my background and training has been in people operations and HR, more recently into entrepreneurship as my own founder of Aspire Talent, where I coach underrepresented individuals and also advise on HR consulting. So when I would get asked that question as a kid, I think my response was I wanted to be a vet. I wanted to help the animals and totally did not go that route, but recognize that the underlying theme of what connects my entire career is this willing and desire to help people. So, or help others, whether it be animals or people. But yeah, I think that's been the consistent theme, is just like enjoying the connection with people, wanting to help them, wanting people to get better.
I love that. I think helping people is one of the greatest things that you can do. And you fast forward to now, you mentioned that you founded Aspire Talent. How do you think your personal journey has really led you to found your own company and do this work?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I think about a lot, because I think that we're always given certain hints about where we're expected to go next. Like actually 6 years ago, before I even started my company, I was kind of doing this sort of stuff for free and like on my free time, loved talking about career and development, and certainly had that interest. And I think Steve Jobs has this quote, you can't connect the future looking forward, you can only connect it backwards by looking backwards. And I can certainly see all of these different stepping stones, from being in HR, being in recruiting, having a side project as a career coach, and now actually doing it full time. And even back then having clients that I was working with, or startup clients that I was working with from an HR perspective. So I can certainly see how all of these things tie together. And I've always, actually now I recognize that I had more of this entrepreneurial bug in me, and enjoying really building things, putting things together from scratch. And that's really what I'm doing now, which is kind of the dream.
Yeah, no, I love that. In terms of reflection, it's always interesting to see, what am I doing for free? What am I spending a lot of time doing that isn't necessarily my full-time job? And I also think, in terms of the quote, hindsight is always 2020. You're like, oh, that is a clear common thread now.
Yeah.
A lot of folks, I know you mentioned your experience in HR and in the space as well. As companies continue to grow, they think about hiring their first HR or people person. I want to ask your advice in terms of what kinds of questions they should be asking themselves, or how do you really know when an organization is ready to make that first hire on the team?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think companies are starting to recognize it's a little bit different now, like versus having HR or having a people person at the beginning of building a company can really just go so much further, so that you're not doing a lot of reactivity and cleanup later on when the company has like 100 something people. That's a lot of people to be managing without someone really reining them in. So, and in terms of at what stage should they bring it in, of course, I'm biased. I would like to say the sooner rather than later. So they're starting to think about how do you actually retain talent? What's the overarching strategy that they want to, these founders want to go after? And in terms of what to actually look for, especially if you're looking for your first HR person, it's always a challenge. You want that Swiss Army knife overall generalist, right? Like they want someone that can do pretty much everything, which is a lot of a harder skill set to look for. But at least finding someone who's a generalist, if not a generalist, someone who's really willing to learn and to take on different pieces and wear different hats is really what my advice would be, especially for someone or for a company looking to bring on their first HR hire.
Yeah, that Swiss Army knife is a good way of putting it, in terms of an analogy of someone who's very agile, versatile, and can do a lot of different projects and manage multiple projects as well, in terms of retention, attraction, all the different kind of life stages of the employee experience. In addition to the kind of executive hire or just like the HR people person in general, another person who is a culture conduit is just people managers in general at a company. And there are just so many articles and studies around how over the past 18 months to, almost 2 years, the role of people managers has really changed. There's an Atlantic article that talks about in a mostly remote world, a strong people manager is someone who gets the best out of the people they're managing, even if they're not, they don't see when they're logging in or logging off at their desk. And the importance of needing to rethink the worker to manage your pipeline. And your kind of experience, what are your thoughts around the new modern people manager, and the best way to kind of help them be most effective, and how we should be kind of measuring the success of people managers today?
Mhm. I mean, taking a step back, people managers they play such a big, important role in upholding the culture of an organization and actually living forth the values, because you can only have so many senior level executives, and there's going to be much more people managers at all different levels of an organization, which is why it's even more important nowadays to give them the right tools to be successful, especially if they're a first-time people manager. And you're so right. Right now is such an interesting time for hiring, with remote, with the great resignation, with so many different things around how do you actually put together teams that can work remotely and successfully. And that just goes even further to show it's important to develop the talent and develop the skills of all of these people managers, because they have such an exponential hold on like layers down and and across. So I think it's, even though it's been really painful over the last 18 months during the pandemic, at least it's opened the eyes of a lot of people to think, yeah, there should be a much bigger emphasis on retaining talent, of making sure their employees are feeling cared for, that their well-being is being looked after. And that really is one of the fundamental responsibilities of being a people manager. So the more they can be aware of these things proactively, the better it'll be, so they're not constantly looking to churn and refill and having all different sort of retention and attrition issues. So it can really go down to that people manager to uphold the culture.
Absolutely. You're talking to, your people manager or your manager, more often than you are the CEO or, the C-level executive who's part of your department. So I think interacting with them makes such a big difference. And like you said, if they're looking at the well-being of, the employee overall, it's really important to have that two-way conversation. You mentioned in terms of coaching that really developing and upskilling women of color is so important. And I would 100% agree, plus one. In your perspective, how can corporations really support upskilling women of color in their company? And can you share any kind of examples in practice of what you've seen be effective and just kind of helpful in that area?
Yeah, so it's all about creating awareness, and coaching is one of the great ways in doing that. And the more, I think coaching should be democratized across the entire organization, so it's not just available to the people at top, because the more they can give access, and there's that word, access, to a greater population, the more that they can empower them so that they can move up and impact and show more representation within the organization. So it really comes down to access. And for women of color, and thinking about some of the challenges that they go through, I mean, we've been as individuals conditioned consciously and consciously over and over again of certain things and ideas of how we should show up in the workplace, or we should not be showing up in the workplace. And sometimes those things are things that hold us back. So I'll give an example in terms of my own case as an Asian American woman, recognizing that there are cultural differences between East and West, and one of them fundamentally being power distance, and being Chinese, recognizing there is a difference in Chinese culture and Western culture of how you work with bosses or work with people who are in more superior positions. That can be something that, if they're not conscious and aware of, they bring into the workplace, and it becomes this thing of, wow, I'm having a hard time managing up or speaking out or pushing back, and it could be very cultural. So the more that an individual has awareness on it and has a little bit more tools and skills to be able to strengthen that muscle, they can really level out the playing field. So those are a couple of examples that kind of come to mind, but being able to actually create awareness of where's that gap, and then practicing it time and time again, so that becomes a bigger skill where it doesn't become as daunting.
Absolutely. I think that definitely makes sense in terms of cultural competency and also just that education piece, and constantly, reminding yourself of that conversation and filling that gap as well. For folks who aren't familiar, can you talk about just how you define coaching, which is different from mentorship and sponsorship, just so everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, great question. So there's so many different terms out there. There's like consulting, coaching, mentorship.
Yeah.
But let's start with coaching. A pure coach is supposed to not give the answers, right? We're not there to tell you how to live your life, how to act, how to do any of that sort of stuff, but really to be a partner and an accountability partner, and holding up a mirror to see, like, this is how you're showing up. Is this working for you? Is this not working for you? If it's working for you, that's great. How can you continue to utilize it? But if it's not working for you, what do you want to change? So a coach will help their coachees with creating that safe space to explore, and versus a consultant is more like advisory, telling you, like, this is what you need to do, this is how you should solve this problem. And then a mentor is more of someone that you can look up to, and has a different type of relationship, I would say. Like, they might also be a little bit more prescriptive and telling you this is how you should follow the next path in your career. But in terms of true coaching, it's really allowing the individual to take that exploration and have no biases around how that person should or shouldn't behave.
Yeah, I think that's important distinction as well, in terms of there's no black and white, right or wrong answer. Every person is different, every goal, and where someone is in their kind of experience is different as well. And I think having that person and just guide as a resource is really helpful. If companies are implementing coaching programs or they're implementing different kind of initiatives as well, I think a lot of leaders are talking about how they're trying to be creative during this time and really make sure people are engaged. As good as their intentions are, everyone's always going to have feedback, whether it's positive, negative, everything in between, constructive feedback. And something that we believe at AllVoices as well is that employee feedback management and active listening. So in kind of your experience, how do you see that employee feedback management and really active and empathetic employee listening manifest and impact organizations, both from a one-on-one or manager level, or anonymous feedback level as well?
Oh, such a good question. The thing about feedback is people can take it or not take it. And this is how I would coach someone, is like, you can take the feedback if you feel there is validity to what they're saying and using it. And if it sticks, it sticks. If it doesn't, use that as a data point, as a piece of information. And especially when we think about underrepresentation and working with people of color, there it becomes even more nuanced, and thinking about, is it racialized feedback, is it genderized feedback? And a lot of times, if managers or individuals aren't really aware of the lens in which they're providing feedback from a very subconscious level, then that can really continue to internalize some of the systemic things that happen. So I'm probably going way off course here, but I wanted to really talk about that because I think it's really important in recognizing, like, look, feedback is just information. You can use it to get better, or you can use it to just evaluate and see if it's valid. And with that being said, one of the big takeaways that I like to share with people when wanting to give feedback is that there has to be a space to give feedback. When managers want to give feedback, there's a time and a place for it, and there's also not a time and a place for it, but making sure that it is to make sure it's well received, teeing it up for the person to know that they're in a place to get feedback, as opposed to like by the water cooler and then giving off some sort of off the cuff remark. So if you really want to make feedback sticky, finding and making sure that both parties are ready and willing to receive it.
I think that relates to the relationship you have with the individual, whether it's a manager or a manager in a different department, if you're just starting out at the company. And something you mentioned too, in terms of power dynamics and just the kind of hierarchy or organizational structure of the company as well. And you need to build that that trust with someone too. So setting the intention, impact, and then, as you said, they can take the information and act upon it or not. I want to ask as well, I'm sure there are a lot, but in terms of what's taking up the most brain space for Michelle, what's the next problem or situation you're currently trying to solve?
I have a lot of thoughts that go in my mind. I think one of the biggest things is like how to just elevate consciousness for people in the workplace and just in general. We are in such a unique time that I think is like a great time to be thinking about representation in the workplace and acting on that, and a great time to be thinking about what's next level of leadership look like. So I I think what's really taking up a lot of brain space is like, how can I become a bigger activator for some of these topics that I'm really passionate about? And how can I continue to just speak up around equality, access, better and improved leadership? So those are all topics that I'm thinking about.
Absolutely. We've seen so many people, especially talk about accessibility too, with a lot of companies going remote first or being a combination of both too, having this conversation around inclusive design, which is really exciting to see. Again, even with the best intentions, people are bound to make mistakes, and that's okay. But are there any kind of cautionary tales or common mistakes you've seen companies make in their people strategy that we just want to share with the audience today?
Yeah, it's figuring out how to bring that the only word that's coming up for me is like feeling behind it, as opposed to it feeling very like prescriptive or performative. We're seeing a lot of companies like think they need to do a DEI strategy because that's what other people are doing and that's really buzzy, but being able to peel it back a little bit more and make it stickier to the organizations. And I think the nuance there, Maya Angelou has this quote that says, people don't remember what you say, they remember how you made them feel. And this is exactly what I think about when I think of DEI in new organizations, is how do you actually empower people and make them feel heard and included, as opposed to saying, hey, we're an inclusive workforce, but actually not putting any sort of strategies or implementing spaces to enforce that. And again, it kind of falls into that middle level management, like all levels of the organization, especially mid managers, being able to uphold the strong deep listening skills, the ability to hold a safe space to explore without fear of retaliation and all those sorts of things. So yeah.
How can we, I mean, I completely agree with you in terms of middle managers, and these are skills that need to be practiced on a regular basis, but it's kind of hard to measure in terms of, are they being effective, or do we need to offer more resources or training? What is your advice for kind of measuring the effectiveness of people managers and making sure that their team does feel like they are seen, heard, and that their feedback matters?
Yeah. I mean, I think programs like what you guys are doing at AllVoices, where there's a safe space for people to share, like if it ever escalates. But even before that, there's now companies that work create coaching for organizations so that they can have a true unbiased pulse on the ground. And like if organizations can implement something like that, where they're getting the feedback from the ground up, not just from your engagement surveys or your performance reviews, but from actual conversations that are happening across the board, like that's a really good feeler to understanding what's happening. But you're right, it is hard to measure. And there's no right or wrong way there. I think it also goes back to what's the objective of what the organization is trying to solve, and then putting some of those markers against that to see if there's any shifts as they seek out a new strategy.
Yeah, every company is different, but we know that, I mean, we're big fans of performance reviews and annual surveys and also pulse surveys, but the reality is feedback is happening all of the time and something can come up. So you always want to have that ongoing kind of safe space, as you were talking about, that's psychologically safe for someone to give feedback as well. The other piece is what you mentioned in terms of performative and just, saying that you're an inclusive workspace instead of actually doing it. If you are an organization that's maybe leading into inclusion work for the first time or kind of earlier on in your journey, what is your advice for not being performative? What does that kind of look like in terms of really being intentional, but also not, putting out a statement to put out a statement to your employees, but the feedback you get is it isn't really an inclusive space.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a difference between like coming out with a statement to say, hey, we value this versus like actually having a heart to heart with with the people to say, look, our numbers show that we're not inclusive. Like our numbers show this, and we would like to be here. And even just acknowledging that and validating that there's work to be done goes such a far way. Like, people are going to make mistakes. This is all very unprecedented. So of course it's a learning experience, but the more open leaders and organizations can be about where they're actually falling short and acknowledging it, as opposed to just like sticking a Band-Aid on it and saying, hey, we're doing this, but actually owning and apologizing, or just being really honest about their areas of improvement, will go such a long way to making sure their people feel heard.
Absolutely. I think leading with vulnerability and that acknowledgement piece is so important because everybody is at a different stage in the process. And also, it's never too late to start, but you have to kind of acknowledge where you are, and what steps, what you're prioritizing first as well. I think having that two-way conversation is really important. And I know we've been talking more so about people managers and leaders, and there's conversations around company culture being like a grassroots effort, or is it more a top-down approach? Do you have any kind of philosophy behind where really this company culture stems from, as you're constantly adding new folks, but you have people that worked at a company for a couple of years, and the combination of leaders and frontline employees?
I don't think there's one right way to do anything. I think it's probably most likely going to be some sort of blended approach where the founders and the leaders have an idea, and the rest of the organization is also enabled to chime in. But what doesn't work is just by like throwing on something without getting buy-in, because that whole change management process becomes very challenging when it just becomes like decided by someone at the top. So being able to have and involve people in those conversations is crucial, and trying it from different approaches and getting people to champion it, and to be a proponent of it, so it's not just this executive project.
Yeah, putting your values up on the in-person or virtual kitchen walls of honesty and loyalty and all of these kind of fail fast mentalities. You really want to talk to employees about what is really valued here and where
Right.
the aspirational aspect of it is as well.
Yeah. And just to add on to that too, it's like, that's the easy part, is like defining what your values are, right? It's like, okay, once you've decided, you socialize it, but then that's just the first step. It's like thinking through the entire employee life cycle, from when you're hiring someone and when you're deciding whether to promote someone or terminate someone. It's like, you can ask yourself, do they fall into the North Star of what the company has sought out to do? And being able to implement those pieces throughout the entire cycle, as opposed to it just being this projected initiative. And another way to make sure it's just not performative is by like doing the hard work. Sometimes companies will just turn a blind eye when they see it's not in line with their values, but they allow it to happen. But the more they're able to enact on it and like really bring it to life, the more powerful it'll be.
Absolutely. I think the conversations that you have behind like in-person or virtual closed doors, the behavior that's kind of the underlying company culture is really important as well. And I think the point you brought up in terms of the North Star of the department or the company, the mission, is also just a guiding light as well for hyper growth companies that are growing from 100 employees to 500. How often do you think folks should be reevaluating the North Star or their values? Because the norms that you're storming when you're smaller are going to be different when you kind of grow and involve more individuals. But what is your philosophy around that?
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, my personal philosophy is like, once you've made a decision, and like once the founders really know what they want, what type of company they want to build, then sticking with that vision, and being able to, this is the hard part. It's like being able to continue to iterate and implement time and time again, so that it aligns with that North Star. Because it's not like the star is going to change. There's going to be other things that change, but making sure they find more scalable solutions, which is what happens when you're in a hyper growth. It's like, well, how do you actually scale culture? How do you uphold it for the masses? How do you continue to reinforce it? And that becomes a different challenge, but the values actually don't necessarily need to change. I have more of a personal belief that it really comes from the founder's vision and how they want to build the company, and the rest is just being able to being able to execute on it.
Absolutely. Execution might look different the way you scale it out as well to make sure that everybody feels like they are included in it. And of course, gathering that feedback as well throughout the growth period too. I'm sure that many come to mind, so this could be small or large, but is there a proudest moment for you in either your previous roles or what you're doing kind of right now with Aspire Talent that you want to share as well?
I mean, I think the proudest moment for me professionally is just like to go for it. It's like, hey, like it's okay to go after what type of career you want, what type of goals you want and envision for your life. Like I feel really particularly blessed to be able to do this coaching work in the capacity that I do. And I feel really proud that I took that leap because I think it is very important in what I'm doing in helping just create awareness, to speak up about where the gaps are and how both individuals and organizations can bridge that gap for underrepresented folks. Yeah, so I have to say that I'm quite proud of myself there.
No, I think that's absolutely incredible. I think similar to people managers, nobody is born a coach either. And do you have advice for people who kind of want to get into coaching? They want to make that impact similar to you for others and be that guiding light. What skills should they kind of be working on, or what questions they should be asking themselves to kind of take on that role?
Mhm. It would be a deep curiosity and honesty to self. Like I think it's really hard to walk. Well, one of the hardest things of being a coach is like continuing to make sure I'm doing the work for myself, as opposed to just pushing it out and saying certain things, but actually showing it and embodying it and how I do it, like self-coach myself. So anyone that is thinking about going down the path of coaching, it's a reflective process. It also takes, when you coach a person, they're also mirroring back things to yourself that you have to consider too.
Yeah.
So um, I think in terms of skill sets, like one of the biggest things is like really learning how to hold space and listen deeply. And, I was an HR professional for like a decade, and I don't think anyone's ever taught me that. We kind of just do it naturally, but now having a coach hat on, it's like really recognizing how to like remove yourself from what the other person is going through and like give them that space to process. So there's a lot to learn. I'm still in the early stages of that process, but anyone that's interested in doing that journey, like it's a fun one.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Hold space and listen deeply as a call to action. I think we can all do that as well in our roles. And I think just leading with that vulnerability, empathy, and actively listening is so important. Michelle, is there anything that I either didn't ask that you want to share, or maybe 1 to 2 key takeaways you hope people listening bring with them after hearing our conversation today?
Yeah, two takeaways I would say is continue to do the work. This is probably one of the hardest things, but whenever someone does get triggered, think of the trigger as something that's really showing you what you really care about, what you're really passionate about, or what actually is sticking. If it's a feedback that triggers you, it sticks because of something. And asking yourself that deeply, I would say that would be one takeaway, and for you guys to think about. And the second one is it's a great time for change. I think there's so much. We're in such a unique time in history where we have the ability to like work from anywhere, to make it work from anywhere, to be able to make a lot of changes over the next 100 years of what work could actually look like. So being able to even have people take a pause and ask themselves, like, what do they want to do within their careers, or what do they want to do in terms of how the organization looks like, it's a good time to just take that step back and ask those bigger questions, as opposed to like being so focused on what's the next thing, how are other people doing it, how are other companies responding to remote work and work from home and all of those sorts of things. Like, it's just a good time to do that internal introspection, both as an individual and also as an organization, of how they want to lead, because there isn't going to be a right answer, but it really starts with what is that North Star? What are the visions and the principles that they want to live by?
It's a great time for change, even if it's scary, even if you're doing it while you're designing it. I think it's important to not do business as usual and just kind of lean into thinking about how you want to lead, which you talked about as well. Michelle, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks so much, Christina.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, AllVoices believes in that employee feedback management. And we know that it's important to hear from all voices in order for the company to succeed as a whole. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.